Shall we recap? Let's recap. Okay. So, with our series on Kant so far, so here's what we were talking about. The first thing, the thing that sort of gets us all going, is the fact that metaphysical thinking, or thinking about metaphysics, is absolutely crucial. This idea that in order to understand, in order to think, to know, we have to have some aspect, it would seem, we have to have some aspect of appealing to the noumenal, right? To this underlying reality that's the truth, the grounding for the possibility. And in Kant's way of thinking about this is things in themselves. And we were all fine and dandy with all the rationalism, stuff like that. And then Hume came along. And Hume's simple questions about relations of ideas, matters of fact, the problem of induction, and all that stuff, he just blows it out of the water. And awoke Hume from his dogmatic slumbers, as it were, right? This is the way he put it. And so Kant's basically spending time trying to figure out whether or not it's possible to still do metaphysics as a science anymore. He realizes people can speculate about metaphysics, but in different ways. But can they actually come to know metaphysical truths through the power of reason? What are the limits of pure reason? Where the critique of pure reason comes from. And he thinks maybe it's possible. Maybe it's possible because the one avenue that we would need to do metaphysical propositions, the synthetic a priori, right, is a real possibility. He thinks it actually exists. It's not something that's a non-issue. But what you would put in that synthetic a priori path to get to the noumenal, to get to the metaphysics, to get to the truth, well, geez, man, that's a train I'd like to take, and Kant would too. And we don't know who that is, or what that is. So that's what the trick is trying to find that out. How is it possible? And the first way that it might be possible is by looking at what Kant called how it is that pure mathematics is possible. And when he talks about pure mathematics, he's not talking about what we ordinarily think of as mathematics. What he's talking about are the basic, as he calls it, intuitions, the basic operations in consciousness that make it possible for relation, comparison, proportion, for these things to exist. And the way that they manifest in us is in terms of space and time. And when you first hear that and think about that, you go, oh, that sounds totally right. We're talking about space, we're talking about time, we're talking about absolute reality. Maybe that's, when we think about what that actually is, that's how we know what reality is. That's how we know what this noumenal is, right? Maybe that's the train we're going to take down a priori synthetic way to noumenal land, so to speak. And he says, well, you investigate this stuff. You look at how space and time work, as concepts, as these intuitions. You can see that pure mathematics, these fundamental conditions that make it possible, they do interact with the noumenal. They do interact with the thing itself. But these intuitions are grounded in us. They're grounded in our operations, our side of the fence. It's a little like if I can beat this analogy down a little more, you got the train tracks of the synthetic a priori way, and they're going to Noumenalville, and you're taking the train towards it. What's the train car? The train car is pure mathematics, but sadly, pure mathematics is stopping right before we get to Noumenalville. You're gonna have to get another ticket, baby. It just ain't gonna work. And this is the problem. So it is a synthetic a priori way of thinking. It does tell us a lot, and it's important to realize too, for Kant, with the synthetic a priori, with the pure mathematical ideas, it's not as though these don't actually do anything for us. They really do. The way he puts it is, he says, by understanding pure mathematics, not just how they're possible, but understanding what it is about how they're possible that is within us, it helps us clarify our thinking. Now, again, clarify. It's not really the clearest thing in the world to read, but it clarifies it in the sense that it makes the ideas precise and it makes them distinct. He reduces, and he is right with that. If you think about what these ideas of space as the distinction between things and time as the distinction within things, and you think about how you would measure that out, he is onto something that helps us understand exactly what the concept is. This is how we delineate precisely what we're thinking about and experience. It's the basic terms by which we do it. It's the reason why he says you try to take something out of that. You take a perception out of space and out of time and say, no, I'm perceiving it. It's just not in space and not in time. And he says, yeah, you can go ahead and say that, but it isn't anything. It doesn't hold in your mind. It's an illusion. It's a fantasy. It doesn't make any sense. This is what he says, right? So it does help us clarify things, but it doesn't get us any closer to the object, the thing in itself, that we're trying to get to with metaphysics. So that first way, yeah, it's going to get us close. It's not going to get us there entirely. But then he's got this second way, the second path that he wants to try. And this is by looking at the nature of what he calls pure natural science, and asks, how is pure natural science possible? And again, when he talks about pure natural science, just as when he talks about pure mathematics, he's not really talking about natural science the way that we think about natural science. He doesn't exactly mean biology or chemistry or physics even. Although, to some extent, some of the things you cover in physics they're getting kind of close to what he's talking about. Basically, what Kant is talking about when he talks about pure natural science is he's saying, how is it that when we observe, when we have perceptions in the natural world, right? I see color, I see movement, I sense an object, I hear a sound, I feel a velocity, and these are set within space and time, right? They're set within these intuitions. But when I have them, how is it that I can make, as he puts it, a judgment around it, right? How is it that I come to know that that thing is what it is? Like, actually, just thought of something. I'll give you an example. A number of years ago, I was walking my dog at night, and it was kind of this going down the street, and it was nice street lights that, it was very pretty, actually, in the winter. And just off on one of the side streets, there had been the city had been doing a little bit of work, and they had some cones up around a manhole, to sort of cordon the place off. But it was very gloomy, and you couldn't really see what this thing was. It's just sort of some sort of gloomy object off in the distance. And I noticed that when you looked at it, it looked a little bit like an animal, the way the cones were. It looked almost like a creature in the gloom. You couldn't make any details, but it was a little bit of a silhouette, close to a silhouette of it. Well, I'm walking along, and there's my dog there, and all of a sudden, she starts growling. And this makes me a little bit concerned, and I'm looking around, trying to see what it was. She's growling at the silhouette. She thought this was an animal. Now, obviously, she couldn't smell it, because there was no animal there to smell. Obviously, she couldn't tell what this thing was. She thought it was another dog or a creature, and she was nervous, and she was really trepidatious. She was a little scared, and she was kind of checking it out. And then I remember looking at my dog doing this, and she's looking at it, and then she sees it, and she goes, you could suddenly see, and her head pops up, her ears go back, and she's suddenly relieved because she could see this isn't a creature at all. It's just a bunch of cones. The reason I tell that story is because of this. Even my dog has this situation where she had perceptions, and she had to come to have some kind of concept about these perceptions. What is it about the way in which we come to have these perceptions, and that our minds, whether we're human beings or canines for that matter even, work upon these perceptions, right? How is it that they take the raw material of perception and fit them together into a concept, right? And from that make an understanding. Well, what Kant tries to say with this is he says, well, basically what happens is that we are, all of us, very judgmental. Not judgmental in the sense of morally judgmental, although Kant's got a little of that going on too, but not here. It's more that what we do is we make judgments about our perceptions. That we have these moves our mind has to make about things, and that we make that we put together certain basic conditions upon this sort of stream of perception that's coming into us, right? Fit them together, and from that we have a concept, right? In other words, when we are judgmental about our perceptions, you know what we're really doing? We're objectifying. We're making an object in our mind about these perceptions. We're fitting them together, saying, well, it's got to have this, 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 and making it into a concept. It's a kind of synthesis, really. Now, the reason he brings that up is because he says, well, if that's the case, I mean, if this is what we do, right? That our mind takes these perceptions and has to fit them together in a particular way in order to make concepts about the world. Is there some investigation of this? Is there some investigation of how this is possible that might help us get down to noumenal land, right? Get down synthetic a priori road. Get down there the way we were hoping to with the pure mathematics, right?
So what Kant is saying is that maybe, to use your train analogy, where the mathematics train left off, perhaps pure natural science can come in and take us the rest of the way there to Noumenalville.
Right, maybe. Or maybe it can pick up some of it, or has a new strategy that might work better. Maybe the two fit it together. Something like that. Certainly worth investigating, because I mean, what we're talking about are these basic principles of abstraction. If we can understand what these principles of abstraction are in our mind, that take the raw data of perception and form concepts from that. Not experience, form concepts from that. Maybe we can understand something about this. But what ends up happening is he goes through and he's got these, I can show you, he's got these tables that he goes through with these. He tries to talk about the nature of these.
It's blurry.
Oh.
We can see their tables though.
Okay, yeah. He goes through and does these judgments. And the
It's OCD.
Yeah.
I wonder.
You kind of get that feeling.
Yeah.
Actually, well, there's a story about him
We can have a word for it.
that the people in Königsberg, where he lived, would set their
Kant lived in Königsberg?
Yeah. Königsberg.
I get it, I get it, but it's still close and funny sounding.
It's clever enough,
Yeah.
yes. And he would take these daily walks, and he was so regular on his walks that they would actually set their clock according to when he went by something. So, yeah,
Possibly.
he might have been,
Yeah.
right? Rain Man, 1980 or 1783. Yeah, this is kind of what we're looking at here, and Kant fills a lot of his work with this stuff. I mean, how I was saying with the pure mathematics that that corresponded to the idea of what's called the transcendental analytic, like how it is that you can analyze anything at all, in terms of the possibility of thinking about distinctions. Well, this part, the part of the possibility, how is it possible for there to be pure natural science? This corresponds to what he calls the transcendental aesthetic. So there's the transcendental analytic, it's pure mathematics, transcendental aesthetic, pure natural science. And again, aesthetic here isn't aesthetic in the sense of ooh-ah aesthetics, the sense of art and beauty. It's aesthetic in the more basic sense of sense. How is it? And it's a wonderful question. It's one of these things where you just wish Kant didn't have to write in this way, like an engineer. Why couldn't he? Nothing against engineers, sorry. It's not always the most most lovely prose. But you wish that when he's got these ideas that really seem to soar, like, it's a great question. How is it? It's an amazing thing. How is it that when I sense something, when I have these perceptions, right? When I'm looking at the table, I see red, or I hear the 70s funkified music in the background, or any of these things. These are just stimulations. These are sensations. And yet, when they come in to me, it's not as though I just sort of get them in and there I am and now I know them. My mind puts them together. I make associations. I remember being a little kid listening to this stuff, you know. Back when it was on AM radio. I remember. Oh yeah, I know. But I do. I remember that. Or I have associations with red. Or I can place it in terms of I can remember what genre music this is and how it fits into how it's evolved in the process of R&B. Or I can look at the color of the table and say, well, the hue of it seems to be coming together this way. Or I can tell all these qualities. I'm suffused with perception in my world. You know, it's just, I'm flooded with it all the time. And yet I'm capable of taking these ideas and fitting them together and assembling concepts just from this flood of perception. How does that happen? How is that possible? Because any conscious being can do this, but they always do it in their own way. Perhaps,
so how does experience sort of turn into thinking? I know concepts, but like, what's that transition?
Well, here's what it is with these maps that are here that are in the Pure Natural Science for the Prolegomena, or in the Critique of Pure Reason, the bigger book, in the Transcendental Aesthetic section. Basically, that is, in that part, Kant, he goes through and he makes these categories. That's another thing, Kant loves categories. He loves to reduce things down to categorical bases that make things possible. And the categories of what he calls logical judgment, so the basic ways in which reason seems to have to move to make a concept, he talks about judgments that are either of quantity, of quality, of relation, so how they stand with one another, or of modality, right? How it is that they're possible, basically.
That's what modality means?
Yeah, that's what the modality has to do with what it is that makes them be the way they are. And he says, whenever you have this, you have this flood of perception coming in, right? It's going into you, and your mind is working on putting these things together. There's a sense, not a sense. There's a way in which your mind has to assemble this stuff, has to bring these four forces of logical judgment together, and boom, 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 make a concept of it, right? And it's doing this all the time with it. Now, if it has to do this, if it has to do these things, one of the big questions that you start to come up with this is to say, well, is that something that would point towards metaphysics? I mean, if we have to think that way, does that mean, do we have to think that way because it's true? Do we have to think about concepts because natural science, the observations of what we perceive and how we logically analyze it, does it have to be that way? And here's the thing. We got the same problem that we had with pure mathematics, only maybe even more so. It's all on our side of the fence, right? I mean, you can see with this quantity, quality, relation, modality, these are things that have to do with habits of my own thinking. As a matter of fact, one of the things that was going on in my mind here when I was thinking about giving the example of my dog, when she saw it back a little while ago, when she saw the cones and she thought it was an animal, well, she went through and she made her own judgments about this too. But I'll tell you what, I'm pretty sure she wasn't thinking in terms of quantity, quality, relation, and modality, because she doesn't have a human mind. She has a dog mind, and her dog mind made judgments. And yet, she still had to think, right? Even though her intelligence operates at a different and presumably less sophisticated level, at least as far as these concepts go, at least as far as this goes. I mean, when it comes to scent and doggy things, she's much more sophisticated. But she's less sophisticated with regard to this, but she still has to do it. The fact that, and this is like the key thing here, the fact that you have to bring some of the internal operation in from your own mind to have a concept at all means that if you're trying to get to the thing in itself, even when you get there, you're never going to get there. And you know why? You're going to get in your own way. Your mind is going to have to take whatever it is it's sensing and assemble those things there. So, again, we've got another interesting situation here. Pure mathematics, pure natural science. Both of them synthetic a priori. Both of them, they're truths that have to be held true prior to experience. Both of them, because they're part of the operating system. Both of them are synthetic. They're building things. They're putting things together. They're comparing. Right? These are both synthetic a priori. So they're both taking the path you need to get to the noumenal and to get to metaphysics. And they're not saying that there isn't any metaphysics. Really, Kant, more than Hume, Kant really does have this idea that there's some sort of condition that something is out there, some truth that's out there that is, as he puts it, the condition for the possibility of reality, the thing in itself, the noumenal. He's holding all that. But he says when we try to bring ourselves to that, it's always a mind that's doing it. It's always a mind that's doing it. And because of that, it's always a mind that has to basically get in its own way. There's a sense in which the pursuit of truth for Kant is a little like one chasing after one's own shadow. I mean, whatever truth there is, even if you gander it, even if you recognize its necessity, you're always stuck with it with regard to what these things are. And this is the problem that you face. I'll tell you, I'm going to talk a little about this in the very last lecture when I talk about the possibility of metaphysics. But I think that point is really, it's kind of moving with about Kant. Personally, I'll just tip my hand here. I go a lot more with Hume than I go with Kant. I find him much more intellectually compelling. But there are these moments with Kant where I gotta say I'm moved. And I'm always impressed. I mean, how can you not read this and not be impressed? But
right.
but there's points where I'm moved too. And one of the places where I'm moved is when I think about what this means. What that when we try to get to metaphysics, we always have to get to metaphysics, each of us, with the structures of our own mind, and that there's a kind of dignity in each of us for that, because it means that provided each of us is doing what we can, each of us is using the power of our own reason such as we can, the operating systems in our minds such as we have them, to try to do this, you know what this is going to point to? It's going to point to a kind of argument for tolerance. It's going to point to an argument that says we must really respect the conclusions and ideas, the assumptions, the inferences that another person makes, even if we don't understand them, even if we think they're entirely wrong, not because they just see it differently, but because each of us can only come at this in terms of what our mind system has with its experience. And those could be radically different because there's no way ever to really cross those things. All we can do is respect the autonomy of the other person. This is where Kant is the great, the great hero of the Enlightenment. This is the point where he says, where if anything, he lifts up past Hume, past Voltaire even, and says, look at human dignity that pushes away dogma, that pushes away ignorance, that pushes away superstition, that appeals to the human being who looks in himself, in his powers of reason, embraces it, takes responsibility for it, and tries to understand the world and owns it, even if he can't ever grasp it and knows he can't grasp it, because this is his dignity, right? I think that's an important thing for me with Kant. I appreciate that. What do you guys think? You guys got questions about it or thoughts about it?
Well, so if I could try to draw an analogy between using these our faculties of reason to exercise pure mathematics or pure science and seek the noumenal truth, even though we know we may not ever come to it. Is that kind of like these modern theoretical physicists who use these crazy equations and theories about things to extrapolate about 4th, 5th, 6th, 7th, 8th, 9th, 10th dimensions, and really believe in their reality, even though we can never, as three-dimensional beings, really encounter what that would mean? Is that an accurate analogy with this?
Well, I think so in some ways. I think that part of it works analogously. Just as the theoretical physicist or the mathematician uses the rules and rhythms of logic that they have to try to account for the nature of the natural world and recognizes that they understand it, in this way, so it is that the philosopher, the metaphysician, is going to look at the world and say, well, when I think about how I account for the world, these are the tools I have, this is how this works, and this is what I generate from it. There is one difference, I would say, though, with this. There's a story that I just heard an interview. In fact, I posted this on my Blackboard page for this class I'm teaching by Brian Greene.
Oh,
great,
yeah.
Right? Great.
The NPR one.
Yeah, the NPR one. And he's a brilliant theoretical physicist, and not just brilliant, but he's also very, very articulate and very charming. He's a real asset. He's a great guy. And he's working on the idea of multiple dimensions. He's one of the guys who was really pushing string theory. And he's been working on string theory for 25, 30 years, something like that. But I remember when they were interviewing about this in his new book, where he's talking about the possibility of a multiverse and what exactly that means and why there would be evidence for it without getting us lost in the mathematics. He says, well, look, the reason why we come up with these ideas is because when we make these, it's kind of related to what Kant's talking about. He says we make these observations, okay? So we make observations about the physical universe. We observe these things that we take to be particles, and we observe these things that take to be energies, and we observe these things that appear to be objects, right? And then we map them out, and we use very complex mathematical operations and systems to track that out. And when we use those mathematical operations, what we infer from those mathematical operations, is that there are parallel universes, parallel operations with regard to these particles, or with these energies, or with these objects, or anything, right? That's what he's doing. He says with that. Now, what Kant would say about that is he would say, well, that's a very rational thing to presume, and perhaps we might reconsider our experience with regard to that. But we have to remember something that's going on here. Brian Greene himself said that when you try to, he said, the way we know this is through the mathematics. And if the mathematics don't work, or they're not there, then we don't have anything to work with. Well, think about what that means.
He goes further than that, though, because he says that we have to assume that our math is right, and that we're coming from the right, like, I don't want to say point of view, but that
that's right. Thank you.
We have to rely on that.
That's
and
right.
if that isn't the case, then we have to throw it all out, and we don't know anything.
Right. And think about that in relation to what Kant's been saying, not even as much as with the pure mathematics, but especially with the pure natural science.
Yeah, I was thinking about it last night.
That all of that has to do with the basic operations of our mind. I mean, we have to assume the mathematical positions are right because of us. I mean, that's not the bill that science was selling us. It's not to say that it's wrong or that it's all subjective, man, or your opinion or anything like that. It's not going that far, because Kant and mathematics, the power of this stuff has to do with the rigor of the thinking. And there is a recognition, well, man, I can't think about this stuff any differently. Right. If you say A equals B and B equals C, so A has to equal C, I'm with you. That's how my mind works too. Yeah. Right? And this is how we are able to establish language and these sorts of things. No one's arguing with that. The difference, though, comes from the fact from where we locate that. Are we warranted in leaping from the necessity of this in our own mind and our own consciousness and rationality to a position where there has to be, where that's what reality is? Kant would say, well, we don't have any access to what that reality is, what that thing in itself is. And again, I must say, whilst I am even more compelled by Hume than Kant, I am compelled by Kant to some extent with this, because I do ask myself, just, not only what is the fundamental particle of physical existence, but what would that even mean precisely? Mm-hmm. What would we even be saying, and why would we be supposing that there is a fundamental particle? I mean, I can imagine there being a truth without being a fundamental particle. And even there's even things in experience that almost lean in this direction. You take a quark. So you've heard of quarks before. It's a subatomic, it's a particle, but it's actually it's made of 3 separate charges. And you take any one part off, and the quark just disappears. It doesn't, because the other two particles
turn into fields.
Yeah, they stop.
Everything
being.
is more energy as far as we know it. We don't even really know what that is.
Right. So their nature has to do with a set of dynamic relationships that's not reductive to any fundamental point, even though our mind seems to require it to be the case. What do we do with that? Well, one of the things we do is we look in the mirror and say, you know what? Maybe this is more about me than about the world out there.
So, can you talk a little bit more about why, or I guess, how it is that Kant saves his arguments from descending into the realm of pure relativism and subjectivism?
Yeah, that's a good question.
Well, that is a good question, and it's actually something that Kant was pretty aware of, because he was concerned. He didn't accuse Hume of doing this. Other people did. There's a guy named Thomas Reid, who was another contemporary of both Kant and Hume, who thought of Hume as more relativistic, but thought of Hume as more relativistic, and Kant didn't agree with Reid. He actually criticizes Reid in the introduction to the Prolegomena, and also in the Critique of Pure Reason. But there's a way that I think Kant would say we don't descend into relativism, because while it's the case that none of us are in a position to establish the noumenal truth of this thing in itself, as it were, right? This grounding. Mm-hmm. There's a way in which each of us must necessarily operate with the same analogical terms of thinking. Like, I was just talking earlier about the table of logical judgments: quantity, quality, relation, modality, and that's simplifying it, because he's got all the stuff that builds up to it, all these possibilities, but he's got these. You can look in the book and see it. He's got all the tables laid out there. Anyway, his idea is to say, well, look, if you look at how ideas are arrived at, they're arrived at because we're using the same modes of operation. I mean, there's a term he uses, again, one of these unfortunate technical terms that he uses, but it's apodectic, and this term apodectic, it's from the Greek apodixis, and it means a syllogism, a demonstration. So if this equals this ergo this equals this. It's a syllogism, it's from Greek apodixis, a demonstration of the operations of logic. And the question is, how would you even be able to do that? How would you be able to make this demonstration if we weren't sort of working with the same operating system, right? The same sets of conditions. We have to be able to do that. The reason why, if I make a logical demonstration, you say, well, we might disagree about the facts, but the logic, yeah, that's indisputable. Why? Because we got the same operation going on. And I would add, too, that if we were really operating on different systems, Kant would say, well, if that's the case, then how is it that we're even capable of having a conversation? I mean, you think about something like language, you think about something like the way we use mathematics, these sorts of things, that requires us to have a commonality in terms of our reasoning. I got to be able to say something, assert something, put something forward, and you have to not just sort of feel what I'm getting at, you have to be able to infer it from the reasoning I'm doing, right? So there's that. I must say, I mean, I'm with my interest in philosophy and other traditions, intellectual traditions, I'm somewhat skeptical. I'm less, not skeptical, I'm less convinced by this argument. I think there's more than one way to skin a cat with this.
Yeah.
But I do take the general idea that at some level, conceptualizing, cognizing requires some dimension of logic to it. And I don't mean like Mr. Spock logic. I just mean, you know, reasoning, that there has to be some way in which we organize our thoughts. And how do we commune as human beings? We tap into that, at least in part.
Yeah. It's still open, though, because, I mean, we see intelligence in other animals, and we feel that they mean something. We see that they communicate with each other. They seem to understand each other, so there's still that opportunity for a relativism. It's just that we don't. Well, that's what we're talking about the whole time, right? That we're stuck in our own boundaries, and so this just shows that.
Yeah, I think that's true.
But is that really a relativism though, or simply a different operating system?
It could be, and I suppose there's certain ways in which we can come to find common ground, and insofar as we find common ground, we operate within it. I mean, I think the other thing. Another interesting thing about relativism, and said a little about relativism earlier with regard to this, in that when I was talking about the little outline I did on skepticism and relativism, that relativism is in its sort of purest form is, and I don't mean ethical relativism here. I mean epistemological relativism. It's kind of a tricky one to really get to, because to really believe that and be convinced that the only way to look at the world is the way that you look at it, and I'm the judge of all things and the measure of all things, that idea itself is kind of parasitic. It's kind of parasitic on there being a world out there to have it all. And maybe you want to go down towards solipsism, but nobody lives that way. No one thinks. I mean, you might entertain the idea, all of this is just my own imagination, my own private experience, but if you God bless you if you do that, you know, or you bless yourself, I guess. There's nowhere to really go from that, and no one thinks that. No, that doesn't help us account for and make sense of any of our other experiences. So, I think Kant basically says that the short answer to the relativism question is just that if really we were dealing with a kind of intellectual or epistemological relativism, it begs the question, how is it possible for us to think or understand or correspond? How is it that we could be having this conversation and have it be coherent? Because it doesn't seem like structurally it would be possible.
It's pretty good. I think I'm convinced. So, I think you touched on this a little bit at the beginning, but can you describe again how Kant's understanding of pure science is different than what we think of when we think of science?
Yeah, I can do that. I guess one of the things that I would say about it is that you know, of course, the word science itself is derived from the Latin word scire, meaning to know. And when he talks about a science, he's talking about what's the method by which we come to assemble and organize concepts so that we know about the world, so we have knowledge about the world, right? So what separates a biological art from a biological science? Well, a biological art, you know, if I were to talk about a biological art, like, I I don't know.
Dolly.
Well, but
no, that's not a good example.
It's not a good example. But like, I would say something like being a good, not that it doesn't involve some science, but being a good masseuse or something like that, where you have to work and generate something and sort of bring something about. The science has to do with using the power of reason to know what this thing is, what's going on in the situation. And so when we talk about pure natural science, you kind of, as with everything with Kant, you kind of have to think about it literally. When he talks about a pure natural science, it's pure meaning in the sense it just has to do with what it's talking about and nothing else. Natural in that it has to do with nature. Not nature in the sense of birds and the bees and stuff like that, but nature in the sense of physis, of physics, of motion, of matter, of, you know, the world. And science of knowing. So, in other words, can our investigation purely about the possibility of knowing about the nature of nature bring us to metaphysics? And as we saw with the nice example you guys were talking about with physicists, with someone like Brian Greene, it can bring us to some really very rich, deep, powerful concepts that can be very helpful and very insightful. But does it bring us to actual metaphysical science about it? No. And it's not, and it's because of us. It's because of the way the mind has to work. Any more questions?
There's always more questions.
Well,
Especially when you're done. There's always loads of them. I don't know how relevant they are. I mean, what I think of when you say that is I wonder about, let's say that we met aliens. I know, it seems out there, but let's say that we met aliens, but they had, you know, more of a grasp on more things or in a different way. I wonder if we even, oops, sorry, everybody. Here, you take over. I wonder if they had access to that, or something closer to it, or, I mean, even metaphysics, would we be able to communicate with them? You know, I wonder if, and if we could, would they even be able to say anything to us that made any sense to us because we're still limited by it? What if they were like, look, this is the answer, 42, right? And we were like, it still wouldn't even matter. You know, do you think that we're stuck in that because of the nature of what we are, because we have parameters? I mean, do we need to be something that would be all-encompassing to even come close to understanding what we want to? And is it just a desire? Do we just want to? Because we think that, I don't know. It makes me ask a million questions. I don't know that they necessarily hold anything.
It's a good body of questions, and they're very important ones. They're questions I've wondered about a lot before, too. I mean, how... You know, I was mentioning autonomy earlier. How would we appreciate or take the autonomy of a being that seemed to us to possess it's a logic, but a logic entirely of its own?
Yeah.
This is something I've wondered about before in terms of thinking about autism, actually, in theories of mind with autistic, where you're dealing with a person whose mind operates, but operates on a deeply distant way. You know, that they're conceptually they are an island apart.
Yeah.
All I can think of is this, and I don't think this is an answer, but it's something I think about with it. I think that there is a way with all these thinkers that the human mind is something that, if nothing else, it wonders. It moves through imagination. It pushes itself by its own nature beyond the horizons of itself. And in doing that, I think one of the things that perhaps we begin to discover, and maybe this is at the heart of our enlightenment and autonomy, is we begin to discover our own limits and seek to go beyond them and to find analogies really with, you know, other conceptual horizons. I mean, things and persons and minds that are utterly different from us, that we could find ways to relate, to communicate with someone with whom we don't necessarily share anything in common in our own experience, but we find these things to relate to. You know? I think
it makes me begin to think that really that our strength is our weakness. I mean, I think that anyway, but that we have limits. That's actually what kind of seems
that's our strength
about
it.
Yeah, that it is our strength because it makes us constantly wonder. Because if we knew more, if we had less limits, then it would certainly not be a life that I understood.
Right.
You know, I don't think this wouldn't be as fun. That's
the power. There is a strength and a power, a deep power, an ontological power, in the fact that there is only so far we can go, but we drive ourselves further. I think this is how human beings instinctively learn language. You know, I think that this is how we begin to discover new ideas, and how we have these sort of radical breakthroughs, paradigm shifts, as it's sometimes called, with aha moments. It's with all these things. That's how it happens. If we didn't have these limits and didn't have this capacity to try to move beyond and find analogies beyond what we know to what we don't know, even if we're wrong, we wouldn't be able to grow. So I do, in answering the body of questions you're bringing up, I'm sure I can only imagine that there would be minds and reasons and possibilities beyond what I know and beyond what I ever know, and perhaps beyond what any human being will ever know. But it does not mean that we couldn't, by virtue of what we are, at least sail towards them in the possibilities of our thinking. I think we can do that, and this maybe is one of our greatest strengths, and it's one of the things that these thinkers lift up. It's one of the it's their optimism.
But he's getting old. It's Jennings and it's